right, we are on session 11, looking at Leviticus, a bit of Exodus, bit of Numbers, and Leviticus at the worship life of the Old Testament Israelites. And I thought, as just maybe a way to get us started, we would look at some words from the book of Hebrews, chapter 2. For this reason, he had to be made like his brothers in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. So as you're reading this, what was the writer to the Hebrews kind of assuming about the people who were reading his book or his letter?
Did Paul write that letter?
We don't know who wrote it.
That's right. We don't know Hebrews. All right. Ask me that question again.
I was going to say, so, and I'm not sure it's a good question, so maybe I'll change it a little bit. Like, as you read through it, the writer to the Hebrews assumes that the reader is going to know what a high priest does, right? Because as you read through it, okay, for this reason, the he there is referring to Jesus, right? So Jesus had to be made like his brothers in every way. So, taking on human flesh and becoming one like us in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God. In order to understand kind of what Jesus did and the picture and illustration that the writer to the Hebrews is using, you need to know kind of what a high priest does, right?
Right.
And what he did. And it says that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. And as we're going to look today at what the Old Testament priest, what they did and some of the sacrifices they made and what the pictures and the purposes of those things were. All that does is help us see more clearly what Jesus did for us, which is really what God intended as he gave these worship guidelines and rules and things that he wanted his Old Testament people to do. He gave them all to the Israelites so that they would have these pictures and illustrations of this Savior that was going to come, so that as they thought about the covenant and as they realized their inability to keep the covenant, and then they made sacrifices to atone for their sins and to restore the covenant between themselves and God, they would be reminded again and again of a Savior who was going to come and once and for all reconcile God to them. And so, which kind of gets us to our objective today, just as we are going to be looking at things in the Old Testament. We're going to look to identify Jesus in all of the Old Testament sacrificial laws, which as we said, we're going to be looking at, as you went through your worksheet, you saw that we looked at a bit in Exodus, a bunch of Leviticus, and a couple of chapters and some of the chapters in Numbers as well. So maybe to get us started, I think the easiest or the place to start might be with just looking at number 1 on your worksheet, talking about altars. And I made a mention of this on Sunday when I first taught the class, is that the handouts that I gave you aren't probably in the best order. So if you look in your handouts, there are 2 pages just of pictures and descriptions of different kinds of altars. And so I thought this was a good place to be able to talk about some of the ones that are set up and that we see in Genesis, to see that, as God tells as God has the Israelites make an altar outside the tabernacle, that we're going to see that kind of serves as the place where the Israelites would come and make these sacrifices. This wasn't the first time God had the Israelites make sacrifices, right? We're going to see that this was something that God's people had been doing for quite a while, and he expands on it a little bit and gives them some other ones that they can offer. But this was certainly nothing new. So let's go through those references on the worksheet, question number 1. And then we can kind of look at just that 2-page handout real quick as well. So references are made in the following passages to altars being set up. So we're going to look at who set up the altars and then where were they. And since these places will show up frequently, I encourage you to locate them on a map so you'd have a sense of where they were in relation to some other places. All right, number 1, Genesis chapter 12, verses 6 to 7. So who set up that altar there?
Moses.
Genesis 12?
Well,
Genesis 12, Moses wasn't around till Exodus.
Well, I didn't do good on that one.
So Genesis 12 would be Abram.
Oh, yeah.
So Genesis 12 is right where we first meet Abram, and it was set up at Shechem. Yep. My guess is you read it right. You just put the wrong name down this part.
Yeah.
How about Genesis 33? Jacob. Yep. And that one also was at Shechem, right? All right. So Genesis 12, verse 8. So again, just a verse later in Genesis chapter 12. So we know it's not Moses.
It's Abram.
But it's Abram again, correct. But this time it was at Bethel, right?
Yes.
And then Genesis 28 and Genesis 35, the 2 references there, also have an altar being set up at Bethel, but this time by Jacob. In Genesis 13, 23, and 35, we have Abram and Jacob setting up an altar at Hebron. Let's see, Genesis. Hebron.
Say that. What was that? Say that again.
So the Genesis 13, 23, and chapter 35 one there. Okay. So it was Abram and Jacob.
Okay, I just put Jacob, but it was Abram too.
I think Genesis 13 was Abram.
Okay.
And yeah, then it was at Hebron.
Well, I put Bethel down again.
It might have been near. I don't remember off the top of my head what the reference was. So
okay. Hebron though.
How about Genesis 21? What did you have for that one?
Abraham.
Yep. And this time it was at Beersheba, right? Which Genesis 26 and Genesis 46, the next 2 are both at Beersheba as well. Right. One was by Genesis 26 was by Isaac, and Genesis 46 was by
Jacob.
Yep. Which, so those 2 pages in your handouts that just describe an altar of stones, an altar of earth, a horned altar, and then a picture of the altar at the tabernacle, kind of just give you an idea, perhaps of, altars that were a bit more permanent, I guess. I think, in some of those cases, the most rudimentary altar that, you'd probably think of maybe with Noah, and maybe with Abraham too, or it could have been any of them. It could just be a rock, just a big rock that they offer the sacrifice on. If it's something a little more formal, then they might set up like an altar of stones, or an altar of earth. But, those become obviously a bit more permanent structures, which again, if you're living there, that makes sense, right? So here's where I go to worship, and here's where I offer these sacrifices to God. So let's, I want to look at one thing here. All right. So the question number 2 here is we're going to talk all about the tabernacle. So which gives you the answer. What structure is mentioned in Exodus 26, 27, and 35?
The tabernacle.
Excellent. So give a brief description of it and explain its role in Israelite worship.
Well, I got too involved in it, but the tabernacle is made up of the holy of the most holy, or the holy of holies.
Yep.
And then the holy place.
Yep.
And what's the other part called? The big part?
Like the courtyard. Yep.
Yeah, the
courtyard.
courtyard.
Yep.
Okay. And the Ark of the Covenant is in the Holy of Holies.
Yep.
And inside the Ark, there are the tablets and the manna and the staff, the budding staff.
Yep.
And there's also the incense, table of incense. Is that
Yep.
right?
Yep, there's a whole bunch of things on the inside of the tabernacle, right? So you have the altar of incense, you have a lampstand,
Yeah,
the table with the bread on it.
yeah. And then, but I'm not sure what's in the holy place.
That's all in the holy place.
That's in the,
Just the ark is in the most holy place. The altar of incense, the showbread, the lampstand, those are all in the holy place.
okay.
Just the
And
ark is in the holy of holies.
Yeah, that was a really good picture. I think that was on one of the things you handed
On
out.
one of the handouts.
Yeah, let me see. Or maybe I've got it, saw it in somewhere else. I don't know. Yeah, I guess I did. They had the place where they slay the animals.
Yep.
And then there's the bronze washing pot.
Yep.
And then there's, I've forgotten what then there's is it one place where they slay the animals and another one where they offer them?
Yeah, so there's an altar, right? There's the altar that they would carry along. But it kind of like, if you look at the second page of those in your handout of the example of the altars, you'd see it had not only carrying poles, but the altar was basically hollow on the inside. It had a metal grate. So you can imagine, building a fire.
Yes.
And all the ash and everything falls through it. And then when it's time to leave, you kind of just pick it up and you can take it with you, and it's not a solid altar.
Yeah. That bronze must not be very heavy.
Either that or you got a whole bunch of guys carrying it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I see the picture now. Yeah, the slaughter tables, and then the brazen lever, is that
that's the big washing
pot thing?
bowl. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's a very good picture.
Yeah, and I think too, it helps you see. So like even the tabernacle itself wasn't just a tarp thrown over some things.
Yeah.
Right? It was covered by animal skins, right? You had all the different layers of animal skins of what was it? Fine linen, goat's hair, then ram skin dyed red, and then the outer was like sea cow and like badger skins, so that it was completely weatherproof.
Weatherproof, yeah.
But too, what would that have made the inside of the tabernacle like?
Looks like it would have been dark.
Dark, yeah. Which I think helps you understand, okay, you have the lampstand in there, right? So that as the priest comes in to carry out the different things that he would do in there, you'd be able to see, there'd at least be a little bit of light, being given off in there. But yeah. And we'll talk just a little bit about it too. Oh, do you remember? So last time we talked just about where the tabernacle was in relation to the other, all the tribes and stuff. I guess, just the point that it was the center of the center of the Israelite camp, as a picture then of here God and his presence in his people was to be the center of their lives, just as it was at the center of their camp, right?
Right.
Got some other pictures for you. So you got I did point out to people on Sunday that this electrical box right here probably wasn't part of the original.
Yeah.
But I think what this does help you begin to realize is, so you see like all the posts, right? And it talked about, they had posts and each had a base, and then you'd have the curtain fence that went around it, and all these posts had bases, and all of this goes, when they leave, right? They pick all of that up, and you can imagine just, it was quite the moving, thing to be able to even just move the tabernacle.
That's amazing that they did that.
And then here's another one. So, I think with this one, so the tent, was 45 feet long. And it was 15 feet wide. So the holy place, right? So that's where the showbread, the lampstand, and the altar of incense was. That would have been 30 feet long by 15 feet long, which meant the most holy place was 15 feet by 15 feet. And two, just the fact that the whole structure, right, is made of acacia wood with gold over the top and silver bases, and gold rings. So even though it didn't, you didn't have quite you think of like Solomon's temple, right, where you had gold all over the inside. It certainly wasn't to that level, but it also wasn't just, a bunch of 2x4s put together either, that this was something where, the Israelites were able to show God, what they meant, or God meant to them, which I think, we talked about it a bit on Sunday, is one of the things, why go to that expense, both with the tabernacle and then later with Solomon's temple, or, even when we think about things that are at our own church, why do that? That's a good, or maybe I'll answer that. Why do that?
Is to show our love to God.
Okay, yeah, that how, the things that we use are an expression of, how we feel about God, right? And that when we use nice things and make those efforts to use the best that we can, it's a reflection of how we feel towards God. So I read in the People's Bible, there was a quote there: the tabernacle was the Lord's dwelling in the midst of his people. The Israelites were preferred before all other nations in that they, as the covenant people, had access to the courtyard of the tabernacle and were thereby especially close to God. Yet, even all Israelites could not enter the tabernacle itself. Only through the mediation of priests was a clear access to the Lord permitted. Although the priests could enter the holy place only once a year, could their high priest pass beyond the curtain into the most holy place. When he sprinkled the blood on the atonement cover, he typified the reconciliation with God, which was to be perfectly accomplished in the New Testament through the atoning blood of Christ. Thus, we see the tabernacle picturing a threefold division with 3 steps or ranks of progression. First, there is, accidentally advance the slide. First, there is the courtyard, representing the Old Testament congregation, which still needed a priesthood to mediate between itself and the Lord's blessing. The holy place was a picture of the New Testament church, where because of Christ's finished work, all Christians are priests and can approach the Lord directly. Finally, the most holy place pictures the heavenly congregation, which has reached its complete fulfillment in perfect fellowship with the Lord forever. So just, having a picture of, that you see it even in the picture God gives to the Israelites, right? As they're in the camp, God is in the midst of them, and yet there is separation between God and his people, right? There's there's walls and curtains and things that, the Israelites, even as they sacrificed, were able to get close to God, but they were not, in God's presence. And, had to use a priest in order to do that. And so then Professor Wendland's picture then is to say, that Old Testament basically was in the courtyard of the tabernacle. For you and I, as now New Testament Christians and priests, we in essence get to go to the holy place, right? That you and I are able to go to God directly. We don't need priests, but we are priests. And someday we will, when we get to heaven, it'll be as if we are in the most holy place, that now we are able to be in God's presence, or we will be in God's presence. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. It does.
Lead to questions or anything? All right. Well, you happened in your answer talking about the tabernacle also managed to answer all the questions in number 3 already. So the container mentioned in Exodus 25 and 37 is the Ark of the Covenant. And so that is also kind of the picture along with the pillar of smoke of where God's presence was in the tabernacle, right? So it was in that most holy place. And you also mentioned what was placed in the container already. So you had a jar of manna in there, Aaron's budded staff, and then the 10 Commandments, right? That picture of the covenant. Good?
Good.
Questions? All right. So who were to be the priests of Israel?
Well, there was Aaron and his 4 sons originally, but 2 of them died because they did some unauthorized fire.
I suppose Southern, they done messed up.
They done messed up.
Right. So
Eleazar and Ithamar and Aaron.
Yeah. So one of the things we're going to look at is that there were, so in essence, the people that were responsible for the worship life in the for the Israelites were the Levites, right? And there were 2 big divisions of Levites. And so you had priest Levites, right? And non-priest Levites. So the priestly Levites were the ones that you just mentioned, right? So those would have been sons of Aaron, right? So if you were a son of Aaron, then you were a priest. If you were in one of the other Levite families, then you weren't a priest, but you were still associated with the worship life of the Israelites. And so especially when it comes to the tabernacle, right, you had 3 different families who were charged with kind of different things. So you had the Gershonites. They were responsible for moving all the curtains. The Kohathites, they were responsible for the vessels. So that would have been like lamps, table for the bread. And, they would move those things after the priests they'd cover them with goat skins. And that's when the Kohathites then would come in and pick them up and carry them. And then you had the Merarites, and they were responsible for all the posts. So you can imagine, like, if you're taking down the tabernacle, right, the priests would come and they'd cover all the vessels and things that were in the temple with goat skins, and the Kohathites could come and, grab them as they were revealed. You'd have the Gershonites taking down all the temple or all the curtains, and then the Merarites kind of coming in last and picking up all the posts and the stands that the posts are on, and then kind of reverse order when they set it up, right? The Merarites would set up the posts, and the Gershonites could set up the curtains, and then the Kohathites could kind of put everything in its place, and then the priests would come and make sure it's all in the right spot and take things off. And then you had some other non-priest Levites that aren't mentioned here, but are mentioned a bit later. You had, ones that sang in the choir and gatekeepers. And those are, might be a bit later. Gatekeepers might be, they're kind of like night watchmen, people that would watch over the tabernacle as well. And then 2 a bit later as judges, right? That they would teach the people and, rule over them, or, make some decisions for that. So the next question there, what were their responsibilities? So the duties of the priests, and we're talking about, so now the priestly Levites, right? The sons of Aaron. So one of their jobs, obviously, since it's already on the screen, was to make offerings, right? So they'd have blood sacrifices for atonement. You'd have non-bloody sacrifices for offerings, Thanksgiving offerings, and we're going to talk about the sacrifices here in just a second. What were some of the other things they did?
I didn't finish that one. The priest.
So you can think of, so they would also, and is their role as a mediator, would pray to God for the people, right? So they would, and you think of, they would do that as they would offer incense. So you think of Zechariah, when the angel comes and announces to him that he's going to, Elizabeth was going to have a son, John the Baptist, right? He was in the temple. He was in the holy place. He was going to the altar of incense and praying for the people. And that's when the angel showed up next to the altar of incense and told him these things. So you can think of one of the big roles of the priest was, right, serving in that priest going to God on behalf of the people, right? So sacrifices and in prayer.
Okay.
And that arrow also goes the other way, right? And so the priests were responsible for teaching the people, right? You think of them blessing the people. You can think, the Aaronic blessing is one that God gave to the priests so that they could bless God's people, right? And so in essence, they now became these people who would speak to the people on behalf of God, right?
Yes.
So like teaching the people, you can think of like probably an easy example would be like Eli and Samuel. But they were, they would teach the people and remind the people of God's word. And you see that too after the Babylonian captivity when they come back and the priests, read the covenant and began to teach the people God's law.
What about on the Sabbath day? Did they act like a pastor and do like a sermon?
No, that was all. It was more sacrifices and stuff, which we'll actually talk about in a second.
Okay.
So the priests, just as far as so we can look at some things real quick as far as what they wrote. Exodus 28 kind of lists 4 parts of the priest's wardrobe. So they had a hat, a turban of some sort. You had some undergarments, and then you kind of had a tunic that went over it, and then a multicolored sash that kind of went around the waist. So that's what the priest was normally. That's, if you went to offer a sacrifice at the altar, that's what they would look like. Now the high priest, I included this one in your handout.
Yes.
So it gives you too kind of just a picture of, okay, when the high priest was serving, he would look a little bit different than just the ordinary priest than what they were doing, a day-to-day work. So, the high priest, was dressed a bit differently. Most days, and then you see on the Day of Atonement, he was dressed a little differently as well when he would go into the most holy place. So I guess, did you have any questions that far?
Was it pretty hot in they were in the desert of a lot, so that must have been awfully hot.
I would imagine it was warm. Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Of course, linen breathes good, but all that layered stuff.
Yeah. Once you start adding a few more layers to it, that would be.
Yeah.
Well, and you imagine too, I mean, they're around a fire, offering sacrifices. That's gonna probably get warm as well. All right, starting with question 5, then we jump into just talking about sacrifices. So how many sacrifices did the Israelites, just say as a nation, have to make in a year? Which isn't that isn't a question on the sheet. Did you thought about just as a nation as the Israel, a number
how many
of
oh wow, that's
the priests. Yeah, so just the priests. So it was kind of, so here, we'll just show you this to start with. So it was kind of neat just to start to think about. So as an everyday Israel, as a normal Israelite, you get up in the morning, right? Or as you're about to go to sleep, right? You could think about your day, and what would you'd realize I did not keep the covenant perfectly today, right? I sinned in many ways. And yet as an Israelite, what did I know was being offered on my behalf every morning and every evening?
The sacrifice.
Sacrifice, right? So that, to cover sin. And so every morning, every evening, there were a lamb was being sacrificed, for the nation. So you've got, that's 700 and some animals already right there. Every Sabbath day, 2 lambs were sacrificed. So that would have been, another 104 because you got 52 Sabbaths in a year.
Yeah.
Times 2. Every new moon. So there you'd have 7 lambs, 2 bulls, a ram, and a goat. So, over the course of the year, it's another 132 animals. When they celebrated the Passover, you can see a lamb, 2 bulls, a ram, and a goat. For the Festival of Weeks, 7 lambs, 2 bulls, a ram, and a goat. The Festival of Trumpets, again, 7 lambs, a bull, a ram, a goat. A Day of Atonement, 7 lambs, a bull, a ram, a goat. And then when you celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles, I believe when it has like Tabernacle 1, 2, that's each day of the Feast of Tabernacles. And so you'd be offering. Yeah, so you look at that and you go, okay, 1,000 lambs, a little over 100 bulls, 30, for almost 40 rams, and 30 goats, for 1,200 animals. And that wasn't counting any individual sacrifices. That was just sacrifices the priests made for the nation. And so, now if additional offerings could be made, for the weakness of the nation or privately by the average Joe Israelite who wanted assurance of the forgiveness of sins, or, some of we begin to look at the sacrifices now. Okay, there's these other sacrifices that could be made. And so, you begin to look at just the number that goes way up, which is, so one of the things that we talked about actually on Sunday was to think, so last week we talked about just the amount of, as an example, the amount of water, that was needed.
Yeah.
And that was, just for the people. And, then you begin to remember what was the Israelites' job in essence? What were they?
They were shepherds,
right? So which helps you understand, okay, where they raise cattle and things. So now we know where the animals for these sacrifices came from. But now you also begin to throw in, boy, there's a lot of water, just water that they need, and how again God was continuing to provide for his people, even as they're in the desert here.
It's amazing.
It is. All right. So if we're looking at number 5, then it isn't possible to go into detail on the many offerings that were involved in Israelite worship. The book of Leviticus goes into some detail. Very briefly, give your impression of the offerings and their central purpose.
Okay. The burnt offerings and the fellowship offerings expresses the covenant relationship. And the sin offering and guilt offering restores the covenant relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And the grain offering is a voluntary act of worship, recognize God's goodness and provisions.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of sacrifices, right? Regular. This was a regular part of the Israelites' life. In fact, the altar of burnt offering, the one that sat outside the tabernacle, right, had a continuous fire. It was a fire that just never went out. There was always fire burning there, and then sacrifices being offered on it every day. Yeah, and it was, yeah, the picture of, and two, how the Israelites in doing this were now approaching God on his terms, right? Here are the terms that God had set in order for the Israelites to approach him. And so they're approaching God on his terms. So we're going to talk just a bit. We can talk a little bit more just about those sacrifices and talk about them. So there are really, when we look at it, there were 5 different sacrifices that were offered. And so 4 of them were bloody sacrifices, right? Where an animal was killed. So you had the burnt offering, the fellowship offering, and those 2, the burnt offering and the fellowship offering, were offerings that had been used before Mount Sinai. So, you think of offerings that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Noah had made. Those were all burnt or fellowship offerings. Now, the 2 new ones that God sets up at Mount Sinai are the sin offering and the guilt offering. And then there you had the non-bloody sacrifice, which was the grain offering, which you mentioned. So, and you also already began to hit on what kind of their purpose was. So the burnt and the fellowship offering was an expression of the covenant relationship, right? We are in, God and I are in this covenant relationship. And so I'm expressing it through the burnt offering or the fellowship offering. If that covenant had been broken in some way because of sin or, something unclean, okay, this is how we now restore that covenant relationship. That was in the sin and the guilt offering. And I think you mentioned what the purpose of the grain offering was. Did you?
Yes, I did. But recognizes God's goodness and provisions and their devotion to God.
Yep. So you could summarize that as Thanksgiving, right? This is the way I give thanks to God for things. So also in your handout, would have been near the end, you also had some things that just walked through a bunch of the sacrifices. So you had one page that just kind of went through the Old Testament sacrifices and their purpose, and kind of what was being offered. And then one that kind of has this slide laid out at the very top of the page, and then under it having the 6 steps of offering a bloody sacrifice. And so we're going to walk through that real quick. So, as you think of those 4 bloody sacrifices, so burnt, fellowship, sin, and guilt, whatever animal you brought, was kind of dependent on your wealth mostly, but all of them had to be an animal that was without defect, right? They had to, in Leviticus 22, it said they must be without defect or blemish to be acceptable. Don't offer to the Lord the blind, the injured, or the maimed, or anything with warts or festering or running sores, right? So in some way, God knew the sinful nature of the Israelites, that if left to their own, they would get rid of the things that weren't that great and keep the best for themselves. And God says, no, as you're making these offerings, either to express or to restore this covenant relationship, it's going to be something that was without blemish, which was also supposed to be then a picture of how Jesus would be without sin, right? And therefore an acceptable sacrifice for the sins of the world. So the animal that you brought was without defect. Then you, in essence, leaned on it, we talked a bit about it, or we'll talk about it with the Day of Atonement, but the picture of leaning on the animal is, kind of transferring sins or guilt to the animal. Again, meant to be a picture of the Savior who would come, and how God, he takes our sin on himself. In steps 1 and 2, the 3rd step, let's see if I can get it here, killing the animal, was carried out by the individual who brought the sacrifice. So if I was bringing a sin offering, I would bring it, it would be inspected by a priest. I'd put my hands on it and, say, confess the sin, so that putting that symbolically, or, putting that sin on the animal. And then it would be my job to kill the animal. In a public sacrifice, so one for the nation, then it was carried out by the priest. So you can think of at least these first 3 steps. In the case of a private offering, like if it was something a normal Israelite was doing, the Israelite would be doing that. So, which I think is too kind of reinforcing the point. The animal was dying for your sins. And so my sins killed the animal, and I was the one who did it. The next 3 steps, kind of on the right side of this column, then are the things that the priest would do. So after you killed the animal, the blood was caught in a silver vessel, or caught directly in the hand, but in some way then it was sprinkled, right? So you'd put it on the altar. You would then put the altar, or the sacrifice, on the altar, and then depending on what it was, you would dispose of it. So sometimes the priest would get some meat, sometimes you ate the meat, told you what to do with the rest of the animal as well. So kind of those, depending on the type of sacrifice that was being offered, different things would happen.
Well, Pastor, about the sprinkling of the blood.
Yep. Or pouring, or they did a whole bunch of different things with it.
Okay, does the priest do that, or does individual?
The priest did that. So all 3 on the right side there, sprinkle, burn, and dispose, those were the things that the priest did.
Okay.
So what I thought we could do real quick then is just look at the different offerings that were made a little bit closer, and just walk through those a little bit. And that way, if you have questions, we can answer them, but we'll kind of use this same chart, I guess, a bit. And just, there are some things that we'll note that are different between some of the offerings. So the first one we'll look at is the burnt offering. So you remember the burnt offering was a picture of expressing the covenant relationship, right? So I'm in this relationship with God. So this is something, showing my commitment and dedication and things. The olah, which is what that offering was called. Olah is Hebrew for the going up. So, it was a dedication offering, in that you were giving all of the offering to God. And we're going to see that in a second here. So you brought each bloody, so we'll walk through kind of the same chart, like I said. If we'll highlight a yellow box every once in a while, just to highlight a key feature of a particular sacrifice. So the burnt offering was the most common sacrifice and used in the daily morning and evening sacrifices. So remember on that chart, there were, every morning, every evening, a sacrifice was made. That was a burnt offering. So what was God, kind of teaching by having, a burnt offering given twice a day? Well, they sinned every day, right? And therefore needed atonement every day. And the blood of those animals couldn't really atone for their sins, because they needed to do it all the time, right? Every day. All right. So they would bring an animal, and what you brought depended on your wealth. So it would either come from the herd, from the flock, or birds. It was always a male animal. You would lean on it and let's see, what's next? Slay. So you'd kill the animal on the north side of the altar, with the animal facing the Holy of Holies. So you'd kind of arrange the animal so he was facing where God was, and then kill him. And then the priest would take the blood and dash the blood on all 4 sides of the altar of sacrifice. So the altar of sacrifice was that burnt, where they would burn it out in the courtyard there. So you'd sprinkle the blood on the side of, or dash the blood, throw it on the sides of the 4 sides of the altar.
Well, I'm glad they didn't do that in the Holy of Holies, because I was picturing that.
Yeah,
But
so not in the Holy of Holies. This was out by where the sacrifice would be offered.
courtyard,
Yep,
yeah.
out in the courtyard where the big fire was and stuff.
yeah.
Then, so one of the key features here is after skinning it, cutting up the flesh and washing it, they would burn all of it on the altar. So they dash the blood on the four sides of the altar, then you'd skin it, you'd cut it up and wash it all. And so you'd have that big basin right where you're washing it. And then you'd burn all of it up on the altar. And the hide would go to the priest. So the priest would, could use the hide for whatever, I don't know what they would use it for, but imagine
Clothes,
clothes or yeah, whatever they would need it for. All right, the bloody sacrifice we talked about was the other one that was an expression of the covenant relationship. So it's the Zevka Shalamim, which is a fellowship offering, and Zevka Shalamim is Hebrew for slaying for peace. So you would bring any animal from the herd or flock, again, without defect, plus a grain and drink offering. Again, you'd lean on it. This time, okay, it's a fellowship offering. Excuse me. This time you'd slay it at the entrance of the tent of meeting. You would sprinkle or dash the blood on all four sides of the altar of sacrifice again. But you would only burn the inner fat, the fat tail, the kidneys, and the liver lobe. So the fat of the animals wasn't to be eaten, but it always went to God since it was considered to be the choicest part of the animal. In fact, I think still some Asian cultures consider the fat to be the best part of the animal because it's the part of the animal that soaks up the juice and flavor when it's cooked. And so, seeing as this is the choicest part of the animal, those are the parts that you're going to see always go to God. Let's see, the kidney and liver were considered to be kind of the seat of emotions by the Israelites. So by offering it to God, again, totally showing they were totally dedicated to him. And then disposing it meat, this was kind of the key feature of this sacrifice. So the meat was eaten the same day or the next by the one who made the offering. So some of the meat went to the priests, like if it was a bird, the breast after it was waved or offered to the Lord and received back, and the right thigh, so a little bit of the meat went to the priest, and then the rest was eaten by the person who was offering it. And so either the day of or the next day. So, it would be a way of to a fellowship. So you might do it with your family, yeah. Good, or questions?
When we say the tent of meeting and it's done at the outside of the tent of meeting, isn't that what you said? For the fellowship offering?
I think that's referring to the whole. I'll have to look it up. I think it's referring to the tabernacle, but I'm not sure if it's talking about the tabernacle itself or the whole
yeah.
shooting match. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll look that up and find out.
Okay.
All right. Then we had two sacrifices that were all about restoring a relationship, restoring the covenant, right? So you had the chatat, which is the sin offering, and chatat is Hebrew for falling short. So, you're falling short of something, or, you've sinned, and so you've fallen short of God's expectations. And so in that sacrifice, you would bring, the priest would, if it was a priest who was bringing a sin offering, they'd bring a bull calf. If it was a leader who was bringing the sin offering, it would be a male goat. If it was a normal citizen, it would be a female lamb or a kid. If you were poor, it was a bird. If you were very poor, then it was just an ephah. Excuse me, an ephah of flour. So you would, again, you'd have the lean on. This time it's a sin offering. You'd slay it before the Lord. So this is the one highlight in this sacrifice. So the offering of blood was the kind of the chief feature of the sin offering, and it's this offering that was prominent on the Day of Atonement. So you'd sprinkle the blood 7 times before the curtain, so that the curtain of the temple, and then you'd smear blood on the 4 horns of the altar. So if you have that picture, you see each of the corners kind of has a horn on it, and so you'd smear the blood on the horns of the altar and then pour the rest out at the base of the altar. And again, then you're burning all the choice parts of it, right? The inner fat, kidneys, liver, same things. You're burning that on the altar. And then the head, the hide, the head, and the offal, so the rest of the innards are carried outside the camp to be burned, but the meat was eaten by the priest who was offering it. And to 1/10 of an ephah of flour, maybe just for context, about 2 quarts of flour. But this was different, say, than like the grain offering. Like when you did it with the grain offering, you'd often mix the flour with like oil or frankincense. This was just the flour.
Okay.
Good, or questions, or?
No, that's good.
All right. The asham is the guilt offering. So asham is Hebrew for trespass. So the guilt offering is one of those things, if I was feeling guilty over a sin or something, I could bring this guilt offering as a way of, excuse me, one second. Grab some water here. Of taking care of guilt. So same kind of deal. So you would bring a ram or a lamb to kill for the guilt offering. You would slay it at the north side of the altar, with again the altar facing the Holy of Holies. You dash the blood on the 4 sides of the altar of sacrifice. You would burn the choice parts again. This time, the key feature is that the meat was eaten by the offering priest or the immediate male relative, and then the sinner, that who's offering it, makes restitution plus 20%. So again, here is a way of atoning for that guilt. You've offered a sacrifice. I've now offered restitution plus 20% to fix whatever it was that was wronged, right? And so now we are now that guilt is gone. So those are the 4 bloody sacrifices. Did you have any questions on those?
Nah, not really.
All right. The last one that we're going to look at then is the minkah, which is the grain offering. So minkah is Hebrew for dedicated gift. So the kind of the procedure, I guess, for offering a grain offering was you kind of had 5 things that you did in 2 different stages. So the first 3, kind of like a bloody sacrifice, were done by the person who was offering it. So the person poured oil. So you'd have your flour, you'd pour oil into the flour, you'd place some incense on it, and then present it to the priest at the sanctuary. Then the last 2 acts, which were kind of ritually most significant, were performed by the priest who was doing it. So he removed a handful of flour, mixed together with the incense for the offering, and then he burnt it on the altar. In the case of a bread offering, that was modified a little bit. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Then he burnt it on the altar. So if you were offering a bread offering, it was modified a little bit. The first acts, again, performed by the giver who brought the bread to the sanctuary, presented it to the priest. The priest performed 3 acts. He'd carry the bread to the altar, remove the memorial portion, and burn it on the altar. So the grain offering a lot of times included more than just grain. Minka, that Hebrew for dedicated gift would have included olive oil, wine, grapes, grain, wafers, bread. Kind of the general rule was that all baked grain belonged to the priest who officiated at its presentation, whereas the raw grain and flour was divided equally among all the priests. So the material for the grain offering was presented as fine sifted raw wheat flour or as cooked flour. The cooked grain was made into 3 different kinds of bread. So you had like loaves or like wafers that were baked in an oven, flat cakes baked on a flat pan, and then round cakes that were kind of fried in a pan. And that's kind of what they talk about in Leviticus chapter 3. The grain from the barley had to be roasted and then crushed for presentation as a coarse flour. And you read through it, and there's quite a bit of things that just talk about the types of grain and kind of what they're supposed to do it. In essence, the grain offering allowed the Israelite to show thanks for the daily bread God had given to him, and just all the different ways that God provided for the Israelites each and every day. All right, did you have any questions that far?
No.
Or things that you're like, all right, that was interesting, or that didn't make sense?
Well, it's kind of hard to wrap yourself around all of that.
I think, and I think that I would say that the big part just to remember and I think you hit it just in answering number 5 is, all right, there were basically five offerings that the Israelites would give, right? 2 were meant to express this covenant relationship I have with God. 2 were meant to, in some way, that covenant relationship had been broken, and so now it's being fixed. And one of them was a way of expressing thanks to God for the different things that he did to provide for me. Okay. Beyond that, I mean, if you want to jump into even more, like kind of what we just did and really study that, I think it's all right. But I think if you have in mind just a general feel for these are what these offerings did and what their purpose was, that's good, because I think then when you begin to read, okay, this person offered a burnt offering or a sin offering, you at least know, okay, he's doing something because the relationship had been broken between him and God, and so now he's restoring it. Or a burnt offering, he's expressing this relationship that he has with God. Yeah, I guess, does that make sense?
Yeah,
I think that's what I would. I don't know if you have to get into it much deeper than.
Okay, good.
All right, so number 6, it has explained the significance of the Day of Atonement, but maybe what I'll do is I'll talk a bunch, and as we go, if you've got questions, just jump in, or if there's something, in essence, the Day of Atonement is kind of like, as we see here, is kind of like the Easter for the Israelites. It was the day that they were, they had these great pictures of how God was going to reconcile himself to them through the Savior. And in the Old Testament was done, through a scapegoat and through offerings in order to make them, the atonement, to make them at one with God again. And ultimately, you just see picture after picture of Christ. And so, which is why the Day of Atonement is kind of, as you see on this chart here, just like the center, the big thing of the Old Testament covenant. The heart of the Torah, as it says there, points to the heart of God's plan of salvation through Christ. So you have, that is some Hebrew for Yom Kippur, right? Day of Atonement. So Kippur comes from the Hebrew word kafar, which means to rub. So kafar can either mean to rub on or rub off. And it can also be translated as cover or remove. So on Yom Kippur, like the day of rubbing, God provides a way for our sins to be covered and removed. So we're going to we can, I forgot to hit that. Boop, boop. All right, which is kind of where we're going to look at real quick in Leviticus 16. Just we want to talk about that Day of Atonement because of its importance. So basically, there was a whole lot to be done in order to prepare the high priest for kind of this big day in Israelite worship. Just as the high priest Aaron separated himself away from others during the 7 days of inauguration as they were, being introduced into the priesthood. So the high priest, 7 days before the Day of Atonement, would leave his home and his family, that full week before the advent of Yom Kippur, and withdrew to his chamber in the later on the temple, but would separate himself. And at the same time, another priest was kind of designated as the high priest replacement in the event that he somehow became defiled and couldn't purify himself in time to conduct the service. And that way you would have, in case something happened to the high priest where he wasn't able to serve, you'd have a backup that was be ready to go. So during that week, then the high priest is diligently studying the laws related to the tasks that he must undertake, just all the different things that are going on that day and the things that he has to do, both the certain aspects of his own daily service in order to familiarize himself with those actions. Maybe as an example, during the days he himself tosses the blood of the daily sacrifice onto the altar in the morning and evenings. He offers up the incense on the golden incense altar. He attends the worship or attends the servicing the menorah, the lampstand in the tabernacle. So just, in those 7 days leading up to the Day of Atonement for the high priest was just a whole lot of preparation and review in order to say, so that he would be ready for kind of this big day. The day before the Day of Atonement, the high priest, on that morning would stand at the, so it'd be the eastern gate, and there the cows, rams, and sheep are to be marched before him, and he watches them intently while reviewing in his mind all the different things that he's learned about them. So here are the things that, the order that they're going to go in, how, what he's going to do, all the different facets of what he's going to be doing on the Day of Atonement. That morning then, so the high priest would go and do his ritual washings and things. And then if you remember that one sheet that I put in there, he would, on Yom Kippur, he would be dressed a little bit differently. Normally he looks like the guy on the left there with all the fancy things. On the Day of Atonement, he's just wearing a simple tunic, is much more, not even is even less than the normal priest, because the priest would have that multicolored sash around the waist. One way it was described is that he looked more like a slave. Again, to remind him, the priest, that he was coming before the Lord in humility. So then on Yom Kippur, the high priest would first had to offer a sacrifice for his own sins before he could approach God on behalf of the people. So he would offer a young bull for a sin offering, and then a ram for a burnt offering. So kind of, you just think of what we just talked about, right? So the high priest he'd have the animal, he'd draw near it, facing the sanctuary, he placed his 2 hands on the bull's head, between its horns, and confessed, so that he's confessing his sins, and then would offer it as a sin offering. Then he'd offer a burnt offering as a picture of his commitment, and now this relationship is restored. So now he's expressing the covenant relationship that he has with God. Then he would take 2 male goats for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering for the nation of Israel. Then you'd get the scapegoat. So you remember the scapegoat would be one where, so they'd pick an animal, a bull, or excuse me, not a bull, a goat. So after he confessed over his own bull, the high priest would go to the eastern side of the courtyard, or the eastern side, if you're now thinking like the pictures of the temple, facing the entrance, and he'd have some assistance with the goats, and he'd present them before the Lord. He'd cast lots, so one of them would be selected for the Lord, and the other would become the scapegoat. He would take the goat that the lot fell and said it was for the Lord, and offer it as a sin offering. And the goat chosen by lot as the scapegoat would be presented before the Lord. So you'd pick it by, that's just picked it by lots. So you've chosen it, take it before the Lord, you've chosen it. You'd offer it. Oh, I think I went too far.
Yep.
Yep. Yeah, sin offering. The bull then. I'm trying to read all my notes here. So offer another bull. You'd grab a shovel to stir the fire so that's your altar of incense. So this is a little bit bigger than the one in the tabernacle.
Is that altar of incense that he's shoveling?
That's not
around?
the altar of incense. That's the altar where you were offering sacrifices. Now, the one in the tabernacle was smaller, but it was still a big thing, because you think of just all the, and correct, then you would have the altar, the incense service. So he'd take the coals from the altar and then some incense, and he would take them into the altar of incense. And then he'd take some and he'd put it.
But that's the high priest.
Correct. So the high priest is offering this now before the Ark of the Covenant. Oh, going too fast. Right. Sorry. He would, then sprinkle the ark with the bull's blood and then the goat's blood. And then he would sprinkle it on the curtain, again with the bull's blood and then the goats. And then he'd mix the blood and sprinkle it just on the altars that's the altar of incense that you see him there. Inside the tabernacle. And then they'd come and do the rest of the scapegoat. So you'd have, he'd place his hands on the animal's head and transfer all the sins of the people to the goat. Oh, that's not what I meant to do. Yeah, yes it is. And then send it away. And so it was led out into the wilderness, and then you'd never, So let me see here.
That's a strange picture there.
So evidently, it's something they would take it and throw it off a cliff so that the goat wouldn't come back. It would die.
Oh.
So during the tabernacle time, it's not sure if the goat was actually thrown off a cliff. It may have simply been left to die in the wilderness. I think in the time of the temple, then it was, thrown off a cliff so that it won't come back. Then the high priest would bathe and change his clothes. And then the fat of the bull and the goat sin offerings was burned. The 2 rams are offered as burnt offerings. And then the ashes of the sin offering were carried outside the camp. And so they take it from by the underneath the altar, right, where it was offered, and you take it out, and then you take it outside of the camp. And then the person who took it out would wash his clothes and bathe himself with water, and then he could come back in. And then, yeah, at the end of the day, the high priest would go home. So, yeah, kind of a big deal. So, what did God say the purpose of the Day of Atonement was? To cleanse the people of their sins, right? So they would have this picture of, okay, on the Day of Atonement, our sin has been cleansed. And all of them ultimately were pictures then of the Savior that was going to come. So did the Day of Atonement fulfill its purpose? So yes. You could say no. Because it only reminded the people of their sins and their need for a real Savior. Although the Day of Atonement was to bring, right, at one-ment with God, it couldn't really achieve that, which is why, like in Leviticus 16, it says that it had to be repeated every year, because the Day of Atonement, for all of its pictures, was inadequate, right? It couldn't atone for the sins of the people, and so they needed to do it every year. So instead it was, again, a constant picture of, reminder of, here, a Savior is coming who is going to do this, and it's going to do it perfectly once and for all, so then it won't have to be repeated. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but do you think they talked about that? Did they understand?
I think if you were a faithful Israelite, I think that you had this picture, that you had promises of God, of someone who would come and deal with sin once and for all. And as much as you saw, okay, these sacrifices were meant to cover my sin, and as a picture of that, you'd also realize, well, they're not doing a very good job because I got to keep doing it.
Yeah.
Whereas Christ's sacrifice covers my sin once for all. I don't need to continue to have another Savior that's constantly paying for my sin. So what day of the Christian calendar would you say has replaced the Day of Atonement?
Easter, or let's see, well, when Christ ascended, or resurrected.
How about Good Friday?
That'll work.
Right, the day that Jesus was sacrificed, right? And so here you have, and just think of what happened on Good Friday, right? Jesus sacrificed himself, he dies, and then what happens to that curtain that separates the holy place from the Holy of Holies?
Tore it in two.
Yeah, it's torn in two, right? To show that Jesus had made this sacrifice for sin that now clears the way to God, that now a person can go right to God because all sin has been paid for.
Yeah. That's some good pictures you got.
So, holy cow. Accidentally. Well, that's all right, because so what I'm going to just double. Oh, wait, here's what I can do. There we are. All right, so did you have any questions that far? Or all right, so what we're going to do, what I told, that's kind of how far, we actually didn't even get that far on Sunday. That's kind of where we're gonna stop right now.
Okay.
where we are going to pick up next week is we're going to talk real quick just about the different festivals and kind of how they fit into the Old Testament worship life before jumping into then Joshua and the conquest. Let's answer number 7 first. Then I'll talk about that. Sorry. So number 7, where is the glory of the Lord now manifested?
In the word and sacraments.
Now, where was it manifested then?
Oh,
Sorry.
okay. That says now manifested.
And that's where it is, Exodus 40 there. The
Yeah.
most holy place, right? So in the midst of his people, that's where you have that pillar of cloud is that, here's the glory of the Lord, right? So it's in that most holy place in the tabernacle, right in the middle of his people. What is the message in its location?
I didn't get that. I didn't understand that.
So just that he's holy, he's among his people, and yet he's separated from them, right? Here is the holy God among his people, and yet still separated from them because he's holy and they aren't. And we'll at least hit the last question here on the worksheet so that then next week we'll just talk about or next time we'll talk just about the festivals and then jump into it. So question number 1 mentioned the shrines established in Canaan during the time of the patriarchs. What other localities had prominence for worship after the conquest? So Joshua 4, 5, and 9 talked about.
I didn't get that far.
That's all right. I can rip through these real quick for you. Gilgal. Okay. Joshua 18 was Shiloh. Judges 20 and 21 noted that Mizpah was a prominent place for worship. Judges 6 was Ophrah, and Judges 17 and 18 was Dan, kind of Ephraim.
Okay.
All right, so what is coming up? So next week, like I said, we're kind of going to walk through those last couple charts that in the handouts that are going to talk all about the festivals. You can think of just the big festivals that the Israelites were supposed to celebrate over the course of a year. And in talking about that, we'll talk to just real briefly about the Christian church year and kind of how we do something similar, not the same festivals, but something similar in how we worship. And then we'll jump into the next lesson, session 12, talking about Moses' farewell, which is all about the book of Deuteronomy. So we'll do session 12, worksheet 12 next time.
All right.
Looking at Deuteronomy.